Okay, here we go. We're back reading more Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend. I think we're back reading chapter 6, maybe, if I remember correctly, of History and Critique of a Black Legend here by Domenico Losurdo, talking about Stalin and the pile of lies that has been put upon his grave since his death. And the part that we're on today is called Reductio ad Hitlerum and its variants. Reductio ad Hitlerum and its variants. The psychopathological and moral approaches are all the more inconclusive because the tragedy that took place in the 20th century Russia was foreseen decades or centuries in advance by very different personalities. It cannot therefore be so easily explained by the psychological abnormality or moral depravity of single individuals. On the other hand, like the former method, the latter approach could also be used to indict the leaders of the liberal West. One may take as its starting point the support given, in particular by Great Britain, to Kornilov's attempt coup d'etat and subsequently to the White Army, still at a time when the latter were unleashing a bloody witch hunt against the Jews and staining themselves with massacres, which were in some ways a prelude to the final solution. As we've learned before, in perhaps even a more direct way than you realize, a lot of the philosophers and the thinkers that influence, like the type of Nazi thought of USSR being a Bolshevik plot, comes from these white Russian immigrants. Anyway, to continue, in order to impose on Russia permanent participation in what the communists denounced as the genocide of the First World War, the liberal West turned a blind eye to other monstrous crimes. After the military triumph, the time came to divide up the colonial spoils. Among other things, it was England's turn to take over Iraq, which, however, rebelled in 1920. And here is how one of the leading countries of the liberal West dealt with the situation. The British troops unleashed cruel reprisals. They set fire to their villages and committed other actions that today we would judge excessively repressive, if not downright barbaric. It was certainly not Churchill who put the brakes on such measures, who, on the contrary, invited the Air Force to teach the recalcitrant natives a harsh lesson, hitting them with the experimental methods based on gas bombs, especially mustard gas. Oh, that Churchill, what a wonderful guy. In this case, we are led to think not of the final solution, but of the colonial war unleashed by fascist Italy against Ethiopia, and conducted in particularly barbaric way, using weapons prohibited by international conventions. Churchill appears here as Mussolini's forerunner. On the other hand, when it came to safeguarding or expanding the empire, the British statesman's crude methods were a constant. In 1942, pro-independence demonstrations in India were repressed by resorting to extreme means, such as the use of air force to machine gun the crowds of demonstrators. Over the next 2 years, Churchill stubbornly denied and neglected the reality of famine decimating the people of Indian Bengal. Finally, to what remain on the topic of colonies and people of colonial origin. To what extent should the final solution of our Indian question in Canada, which until 1931 was part of the British Commonwealth, cast a shadow also on an influential member of the British political class? Churchill? The man who, as Prime Minister, from 1951 to 1955, is in any case to be held responsible for the genocidal practices resorted to by the London government in the attempt to crush the Mau Mau revolt. But let us return to pre-war Europe. After Hitler came to power, the government in London tried in every way to divert to the east the expansionistic fury of the Third Reich. In this connection, two Canadian historians arrived at a thought-provoking conclusion. Blame for the tragedy of World War II, including the Holocaust, must rest partly with Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax, and their close associates. And yet, Britain could not avoid confrontation with Nazi Germany, and faced it by resorting at first to the indiscriminate and terrorist bombing of German cities, with the consequent massacre of civilian population. This has led two American historians to make a comparison with the treatment inflicted by the Nazis on the Jewish people. It was the Soviet leadership who were trying to contain the bombing, as is clear from Dimitrov's diary note of March 17, 1945. Quote, "Audience with Stalin tonight, together with Molotov. Discussed issues pertaining to Germany. The British want to dismember Germany, Bavaria and Austria, the Rhine region, etc. They are using every means available to destroy their competitor, viciously bombing German factories and plants. We're keeping their air forces out of our zone of Germany, but they're doing everything they can to bomb there as well. What is needed is for some Germans to appear who are capable of salvaging what can still be salvaged for the survival of German people. Organize the municipalities, local city councils, fix economic life, etc. on German territory taken and occupied by the Red Army. Create local government agencies from which will come out a German government as well." Unquote. The fiery hell unleashed by the British Air Force is all the more odious because 2 weeks after the outbreak of the war, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain had declared, quote, "Whatever be the lengths to which others may go, His Majesty's government will never resort to the deliberate attack on women and children and other civilians for purposes of mere terrorism." Unquote. In fact, plans for indiscriminate and terrorist bombing had begun to take shape during the First World War. As it dragged on without reaching a conclusion, Churchill had planned a 1,000-bomber attack on Berlin for 1919. Such plans continued to be developed after victory. That is, one could say, to imitate the cursory way of arguing of today's fashionable ideologists, the then leading country of the liberal West was planning a new genocide, while completing the one it began in 1914. In any case, it was precisely England that became the protagonist of the systematic destruction inflicted on German cities towards the end of the Second World War. As well, one thinks in particular of Dresden, a destruction planned and carried out with the declared intention of leaving no way out for the civilian population, chased and engulfed by fire, impeded by delayed fire bombs from attempts to escape, and often machine gunned from above. These practices appear all the more sinister when one considers the statement made by Churchill in April 1941. Quote, there are less than 70 million malignant Huns, some of whom are curable and others killable. Unquote. If not outright genocide, as Nolte believes, it is clear that there was a massive thinning out of the German population being considered. It is in this perspective that we can place the strategic bombing campaign from 1940 to 1945. Churchill eliminated the people of Cologne, Berlin, and Dresden as Huns. The British Prime Minister proved to be no less ruthless in carving out London's zone of influence in Europe and systematically liquidating partisan forces considered hostile or suspicious. The instructions given to the British Expeditionary Force in Greece speak for themselves. Do not hesitate to act as if you were in a conquered city where a local uprising has erupted. And again, some things should not be done halfway. Unquote. Now to the Cold War. Some time ago, The Guardian revealed that between 1946 and 1948, Great Britain prepared prison camps in Germany for communists or elements suspected of communist sympathies, real or presumed Soviet spies. Images showed the distraught and suffering faces of young skeletal young men, subjected for months to deprivation of food and sleep, clubbed repeatedly, and exposed to extremely low temperatures. Inhumane treatment that resulted in the death of some inmates. Imprisoned there were also dozens of women who were not spared torture. To carry out this torture, instruments were used at times inherited from the Gestapo. In effect, these camps were worthy of the German concentration camps. As can be seen, there repeatedly emerges a race between the practices implemented in the 20th century by Great Britain and the practices dear to the Third Reich. We come to results that are not different when we deal with the United States. In this case, the hypocrisy that we have seen characterizing Chamberlain reaches its extreme. Immediately after the outbreak of the Second World War, it was Franklin D. Roosevelt who condemned the aerial bombardments targeting civilian populations as contrary to the sentiments of every civilized man and woman, and to human conscience, and as an expression of inhumane barbarism. Subsequently, as proof of an even more inhumane barbarity, was the US war machine which proceeded to destroy Japanese cities in a systematic and terroristic manner, and took an active part in the analogous operation against German cities. Nor should one underestimate the bombing of Italy, which was also aimed at striking at the population and undermining their morale. It was F.D. Roosevelt himself who pointed this out. We will give the Italians a taste of some real bombing, and I am more than sure they will remain standing under this kind of pressure. The terrorist bombing campaign culminated under the Truman administration in the use of nuclear weapons against a country by then already at the end of its rope. A further gruesome detail should be added. It has been pointed out that the purpose of annihilating the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not to push Japan closer to capitulation, but instead aimed more at the Soviet Union, to which a dire warning was being issued. So we are in the presence of two acts of terrorism of the highest scale that are, moreover, across the board. Tens and tens of thousands of defenseless civilians of the old enemy, or rather of the former enemy that is in the process of being transformed into an ally, are massacred in order to terrorize the ally, already targeted as the new enemy and as a new target of the genocidal practices that had just been tested. But the war in Asia leads itself. Sorry. But the war in Asia lends itself to further considerations. It is now widely accepted that the Pearl Harbor attack was foreseen well in advance, and in fact was provoked by an oil embargo that left Japan little alternative. But once the attack was consummated, the war was conducted by Washington under the banner of a moral indignation that was certainly hypocritical, in light of what we now know, but then all the more deadly. It was not just the destruction of cities. One should think of the mutilation of corpses, and even the mutilation of the enemy in the last flickers of life, so as to obtain souvenirs, often quietly or proudly displayed. Above all, the ideology behind these practices is significant. The Japanese were branded as subhuman, with recourse to a category that was central to Nazi discourse. And to this discourse, we are led again when we see F.D. Roosevelt entertain the idea of inflicting castration on the Germans. The latter, once the war was over, were imprisoned in concentration camps where, out of sheer sadism or out of a spirit of revenge, they were forced to suffer hunger, thirst, and all kinds of deprivation and humiliation, while the specter of death by starvation hovers over a thoroughly defeated people. To return to the topic of the statement, who, perhaps more than any other, has been stylized as the champion of freedom, Roosevelt did not change the policy traditionally followed by Washington in Latin America. And in 1937, a bloodthirsty dictator, Anastasio Somoza, had come to power in Nicaragua, thanks to the National Guard trained by the USA. Domestically, the cities built under F.D. Roosevelt's administration continued explicitly to exclude African Americans. Actually, housing for defense workers, built or financed by the government during World War II, was deliberately subjected to strict segregation than even that in place for housing in surrounding communities. Moreover, even the armed forces maintained strict segregation during the war. What is more, despite the urging of the sections of the Republican Party, the president never pushed for an anti lynching bill. Such acts continued to be staged in the South as a spectacle for the masses of men, women, and children who enjoyed the sight of the most sadistic humiliation and torture inflicted on a victim. A torture that was slow, prolonged as much as possible, in effect, unending. Finally, in January 1941, after F.D. Roosevelt championed the United States as the country that had continuously and peacefully evolved without the concentration camp, immediately following the outbreak of the war, he restored to that same institutions by sovereignly and collectively depriving the Japanese American community of freedom without distinction of age or sex. Nowadays, it is almost a truism to compare Stalin and Hitler, but it may be interesting to read the balance sheet of the strategic bombing of Germany that, starting particularly with the firestorm that devoured Dresden and its inhabitants, a German author writes, quote, "The corpses' fate corresponded to the killing procedure. The victims of extermination do not have an individual grave or an individual death, because their right to live is not recognized. The death 1,000 children under 10 years of age is not punishment." Palmer Harris, director of the air campaign on German cities, does not attribute them any guilt. Churchill merely claimed that they could not assert any rights from him. Maybe in World War I they would have had such rights, but not by World War II. Hitler, Churchill, and Roosevelt took their rights away. Unquote. The juxtaposition of these three personalities is certainly a forceful polemic, which seems to reproduce a widespread state of mind in the Germany of the immediate post war period. In a Germany destroyed, isolated by the ban on fraternization, and driven to the threshold of starvation by the liberal West. A conversation was reported from the American zone that took place between two exacerbated German citizens. Quote, "Yes, Hitler was bad. Our war was wrong. But now they are doing the same wrong to us. They are all the same. There is no difference. They want to enslave Germany in exactly the same way as Hitler wanted to enslave the Poles. Now we are the Jews, the inferior race." Unquote. If the first of the two texts cited above proceeds to a partial juxtaposition of Hitler, Churchill, and F.D. Roosevelt, the second goes as far as their total assimilation into one another. Today's dominant ideology instead equates Stalin with Hitler, but in doing so, it is just as cursory as the two German citizens exacerbated by hunger and humiliation. There is no difference. Tragic conflicts and moral dilemmas. Even if one wants to concentrate on the strictly moral dimension, the comparison between the protagonists of the great anti fascist alliance is certainly not without its contrasts. But how then to explain today's Manchean opposition? Let us return to the centuries-old process behind the catastrophe that exploded with the collapse of the Tsar's autocracy. Unfortunately, while accepted at a time of historical reconstruction, the prospect of a long term vanishes as if by magic when one moves on to the formulation of moral judgment. Everything is reduced to the demonization of the period that began with October 1917 and of Stalin in particular. Do they bear no responsibility? Those who for so long supported a regime whose social relations were so violent and so violently dehumanizing that they aroused in personalities so different from one another. Maestri, Marx, wit, the foreboding of catastrophe. Have they nothing to reproach themselves with? Those who unleashed the First World War, and who in the West, in order to force Russia to participate in it to the end, did not hesitate to arm and support even the most ferocious reactionary bands. If, as one author of if, as one of the authors of the Black Book of Communism argues, Stalinism began to take shape in 1914, why are those in the dock of the accused not those responsible for the carnage, but only those who tried to prevent it or hasten its finish? At least as far as the genesis and development of the Second World War, the problematic character of the moral judgment to be made on the Western and liberal statesmen has not escaped the notice of the most alert authors. We have seen two Canadian historians attribute to the British protagonists of the policy of appeasement, and indeed eastward diversion of Nazi expansionism, co responsibility for the tragedy of the World War II, including the Holocaust. Then there is the problem of how the liberal West conducted the war once it broke out. Of course, here again, the dominant ideology gets off lightly. A successful historian and journalist, whose articles are also hosted in the New York Times, has so little doubt about the wisdom or morality of using the atomic bomb against Japan that to decline the use of the super bomb would have been illogical, indeed irresponsible. Certainly, there was a massacre of the innocent civilian population, but those who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the victims not so much of Anglo American technology as of a paralyzed system of government made possible by evil ideology, which had expelled not only absolute moral values, but reason itself. Unquote. These firm certainties rest on a very simple assumption. The responsibility for a horrible action is not necessarily to be attributed to the material author of that action. A similar action, a similar argument has long been made by the leadership of the USSR. The horror that took place at crucial moments in the country's history was obviously acknowledged. But the responsibility for this was attributed to imperialist encirclement and the aggressive policy of the great capitalist powers. It must be noted, however, that the journalist historian hosted and paid homage to in the most authoritative media outlets applies the criterion he enunciates only to the liberal and Anglo-Saxon West. However, to make a criterion valid only for oneself and one's own side is the very definition of dogmatism on the theoretical level and hypocrisy on the moral level. Fortunately, on Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, less reductive voices can be heard. A distinguished U.S. philosopher, Michael Walzer, observes that by resorting to the atomic bomb to kill and terrorize civilians, without even attempting real negotiations with the Japanese, the already victorious Americans were committing a double crime. Walzer came to a similar conclusion in regard to the destruction of Dresden and other German and Japanese cities carried out when the war was virtually won. In a different way, the problem arose in the years in which the world seemed to be witnessing the triumph of the Third Reich, when Great Britain began its campaign of strategic bombing, which in Germany systematically and mercilessly struck the civilian population. It was a tragic moment, and the British rulers were faced with a terrible moral dilemma that can be formulated as follows. This is from Walzer. Quote, "Can soldiers and statesmen override the rights of innocent people for the sake of their own political community?" I am inclined to answer this question affirmatively, though not without hesitation and worry. What choice do they have? They might sacrifice themselves to uphold the moral law, but they cannot sacrifice their countrymen. Faced with an inescapable horror, their options are exhausted. They will do what they must to save their own people. Unquote. The danger of the Third Reich's triumph of evil personified in the world demands a supreme urgency, a state of necessity. As well, must be recognized that necessity knows no rules. Certainly, bombings aimed at killing and terrorizing the civilian population of the enemy country are a crime, and yet, I dare to say that our history will be nullified and our future condemned unless I accept the burden of criminality here and now. The young Lucas argued similarly when, driven by his horror to the carnage of the First World War, he made his revolutionary choice. In affirming the inescapability of guilt and in appealing to serious consciousness and a sense of moral responsibility, he exclaimed with Hebel, "Even if God had placed sin between me and the deed enjoined upon me, who am I to be able to escape it?" Presumably, the Hungarian philosopher faced the years of Stalinist terror with the same frame of mind later, as the threat of the Third Reich loomed ever larger. We can now turn our gaze to the Soviet Union. It is worth noting that the thesis formulated at the time by Toynbee, that what made Stalingrad possible was the path taken by the Stalinist USSR from 1928 to 1941, is now confirmed by quite a few historians and scholars of military strategy. It is quite likely that without the abandonment of the NEP, the collectivization of agriculture, with the stabilization of the flow of food resources from the countryside to the city and to the front, and industrialization in 4 stages, with the development of the war industry and the emergence of new industrial centers in the eastern regions at a safe distance from the invading army, it would have been impossible to counter Hitler's aggression victoriously. Quoting Mayer, "Soviet Russia's unequaled and uncontested contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was closely bound up with Stalin's stubborn Second Revolution." Indeed, judging from Churchill, even the trial of Tukhachevsky in the Great Terror as a whole can be considered to have played a positive and very relevant role in the defeat of Operation Barbarossa. Should we then justify the concentrationary universe that made it possible to avoid an inescapable horror for the Soviet people and all humanity? Walzer rightly places strict restrictions on his principle. It can only be considered valid if, in addition to being unusual and horrifying, the danger is also imminent. It could be said that at least the second requirement was absent in the Soviet Union. Stalin initiated the forced collectivization of agriculture and industrialization in forced stages, which ended up provoking a horrific expansion of the concentrationary universe, when the danger of war was still remote, and Hitler had not even come to power. It could be counter-argued, however, that Great Britain, too, promoted the plan to build an air fleet suitable for future strategic bombings at least 2 decades before the supreme emergency broke out. On the contrary, this plan had begun to take shape during the First World War, and had therefore been inspired by a competition for hegemony, which had been going on at least since the end of the 19th century. Quite different was the picture presented by the country that had emerged from the October Revolution. Widespread in Europe, the analysis made by General Foch, among others shortly after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years," was well known to Stalin, who felt the urgency of the task of remedying the backwardness revealed by Russia in the course of the First World conflict. As far as the Eastern Front was concerned, this conflict had been repeatedly read by Wilhelm II as a racial war, in which the very existence of the warring peoples, whether the Germanic race is to be or not to be in Europe, was at stake. It was a clash that ruled out any reconciliation or mutual recognition. Peace is not at all possible between Slavs and Germans. Beginning above all with Brest-Litovsk, voices had emerged in the Wilhelmian Reich that looked eastward for a solution to the problem of living space, and that envisaged an agreement with England in order to bring about the dismemberment of Russia, and to create the conditions for the world position of Germany, with the German people as a grand continental power. Sound familiar? A few years later, in Mein Kampf, Hitler enunciated in no uncertain terms his program of building a continental German empire, to be built primarily on the ruins of the Soviet Union. It is not difficult to identify the line leading from Brest-Litovsk to Operation Barbarossa, and this sufficiently explains Stalin's anxieties. In any case, the category of imminent danger was far from unambiguous. There was no determinate temporal magnitude to measure it. Imminent was a danger which, in order to be dealt with adequately, allowed no delay. If then, in addition to the temporal sense, we understand imminence in the spatial sense, it was clearly the Soviet Union that was exposed to a more imminent danger. In the end, while the systematic killing of the population by aerial bombardment is a crime in itself, the collectivization of agriculture and the industrialization in 4 stages led to a series of crimes. See the difference there? Dogmatism and hypocrisy would be shown by those who would question the moral dilemma only of Anglo-Saxon statesmen. On the other hand, even if we affirm with Walzer that in the face of supreme emergency, a statesman must know how to take on the burden of crime here and now, it is difficult to move from the general to the particular. When we read of the atrocious experiences suffered by individual prisoners in the Gulag, overwhelmed by the horror of whose origins and reasons they cannot even fathom, we are led to exclaim with Petrarch, "Poor and naked you go, philosophy." But a similar consideration applies to the victims of strategic bombing. Can the supreme emergency really justify what the Chronicle reported? Quote, "The first series of bombs fell around 9 a.m. The streets had been filled with lines of shoppers, and 700 people were wiped out, almost exclusively women and children. Fighter bombers pursued and fired on the people fleeing eastward into the forests." Unquote. And in other places, fighter bombers started firing their machine guns on random pedestrians, bicyclists, train passengers, and farmers in their fields. The funerals took place under strafer fire. Since there was a shortage of coffins, cloth was used. The bombs penetrated the apartment buildings and got caught in the ceilings between the stories. For days on end, they continued to explode day and night with a deafening bang, toppling walls and killing residents in their sleep. People had to flee through the flames and hurry to their deaths. It even happened that they took their own lives or pushed each other into the flames. Criminal actions carried out at the moment when the defeat of the Third Reich is already evident. Are they justifiable while the supreme emergency looms? The difficulty of moving from the general to the particular becomes apparent. The Soviet Katyn and the American South Korean Katyn. In contrast to the collectivization of agriculture and industrialization in 4 stages, the massacre of Polish officers, decided by the Soviet leadership and carried out in Katyn in April March 1940, was a crime in itself. The weight of the challenge with Finland was still being felt. After a vain attempt to proceed with the consensual exchange of territories undertaken by Stalin in order to give a minimum of territorial depth to the defense of Leningrad, the city that was then the protagonist of an epic resistance to Nazi aggression. The war now risked spreading and becoming more widespread. In such an eventuality, how would the Polish officers captured by the USSR react after the breakup of Poland? Moscow tried in vain to persuade them to abandon their anti-Soviet positions. A legacy of the conflict that had begun with the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, and was thus tending to take on the brutal characteristics of a civil war. The situation had become very difficult. There was a danger that the USSR, as such, would be engulfed in war. And there was no lack of Western circles thinking of an overthrow of the Stalinist regime. It was this serious security problem that precipitated the horrendous decision for which Stalin must later have bitterly regretted the subsequent embarrassment and complications. That is, even in the case of the Katyn executions, the moral dilemmas to which Walzer draws attention are not absent. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to invoke the supreme emergency in this case as well, further stretching a criterion that already in itself runs the risk of being too loose. But even if it is unjustifiable, the crime we are now dealing with does not refer to the particular characteristics of Stalin's personality or of the regime he directed. One should recall the crime of which the American General Patton was guilty when, landing in Sicily, he ordered the killing of the Italian soldiers, who surrendered after some tough resistance. Even if here we are dealing with a smaller infamy, it must be kept in mind that it is not a real concern for the security of the country that provoked it, but rather the spirit of revenge, or perhaps even racial contempt. That is to say, in this case, it is a crime for abject motives. And yet, if we are to seek a real analogy with Katyn, we must refer to other tragedies and other horrors. 10 years after the Soviet Katyn, what we might define as the US South Korean Katyn took place. The Korean War was underway. From the savagely bombarded north, a mass of refugees headed to the south. How were they received? The US military had a policy of shooting approaching civilians in South Korea. The victims were mostly women and children, but it was feared that North Korean infiltrators were among them. However, investigating one of perhaps the most well-documented cases, the killings taking place at No-Gun-ri, no evidence emerged of enemy infiltrators. We are here in the presence not of the orders of a single, albeit brilliant and authoritative general or marshal, as Patton was, but of the policy sanctioned by the highest US military and political leadership. And this circumstance makes one think of Katyn all the more so because in both cases security was at stake. To guarantee it, the US and its allies did not just kill the refugees, they also considered it necessary to liquidate any potential fifth column. For example, in the town of Daejeon in July 1950, 1,700 Koreans who were accused of being communists were ordered by the police to dig their own graves, after which they were shot. As a witness recounted, quote, "One Sunday morning, at dawn, in the apparently deserted town of Chichewan, I saw a procession of men and women, bound to each other with their hands behind their back, beaten and clubbed, as they made their way from the police station to the trucks where they were being loaded. They were then put to the firing squad and left unburied a mile or two further away." This was a large-scale operation. In a cobalt mine near Daegu, in the south of the country, investigators have so far collected the remains of 240 people. That is only a fraction of the estimated 3,500 prison inmates the communist suspects believed to have been whisked from homes and prison cells, then executed and thrown into the mine shaft between July and September 1950. Sometimes, women and children were also the victims of summary executions. It would appear that in such cases, not even the suspected communist family was spared. The obsession with security affects not only the rear, but also the newly conquered or reconquered cities. Here's what happens in one of them. Quote, they told us to light our cigarettes. Then they began shooting their rifles and machine guns. After a while, an officer called out, any of you who are still alive can stand up and go home now. Those who did were shot again. How many victims in total of the two practices, the killing of refugees and the liquidation of those suspected of communism? In fact, the extent of what the victims' families call Korea's killing fields is not yet fully measured. A provisional tally can be made for now. Investigators have so far identified 1,222 probable cases of mass killings. The cases include 215 incidents in which survivors say American planes and ground troops killed unarmed refugees. The US and South Korean Katyn does not seem to be of smaller proportions than the Soviet one. And in any case, it shows an extra degree of recklessness. For war conducted thousands of kilometers from their own country, the Washington leaders could not have invoked even the shadow of a supreme emergency. But here, it is not a question of establishing a hierarchy between two crimes that are both unjustifiable. It is instead a question of noting the inadequacy of the moral Manchian approach to understanding Stalin and the country he led. The inevitability and complexity of moral judgment. Well, in a sense, it is inevitable. Moral judgment would be superficial and hypocritical if it were formulated by abstraction from the historical context. Hence, its complexity and problems. At the same time, it is necessary to bear in mind and unravel the interweaving of objective circumstances and subjective responsibilities. And, as far as the latter are concerned, it is necessary to distinguish between the responsibilities of a ruling group as a whole and those of individuals. As far as the ruling group of Soviet Russia is concerned, it came to power at a time when, in the words of a Christian witness, sympathetic to the changes brought about by October 1917, pity has been killed by the omnipresence of death. It was forced to face a very prolonged state of exception. In a situation characterized, to quote the analysis of one of the authors of the Black Book of Communism, by an unprecedented brutalization. Generalized and without any possible terms of comparison with that known to Western societies. That is to say, if the protagonists of the 20th century were first to deal with the devastating conflicts and moral dilemmas that characterized the Second 30 Years' War, Stalin also had to contend with the conflicts and moral dilemmas peculiar to Russia's history, and the Second Time of Troubles. One could say that the shadow of supreme emergency hung over the 30 years during which he wielded power. However, we must not lose sight of the fact that it was not only the objective conditions that seriously hindered or made impossible the passage from the state of exception to the condition of normality. Messianism had also contributed to this. Admittedly, powerfully stimulated by the horror of the First World War, and yet intrinsic to a vision that expects the disappearance of the market, of money, of the state, of the legal norms. Disappointment or indignation at the failure of all of this to come to pass further stimulated conflict. And a conflict which was not possible to regulate through purely formal judicial norms. insofar as they are themselves destined to disappear. The result was an additional violence that cannot be justified by referring to the state of exception or to the supreme emergency. In this sense, moral judgment coincides with political judgment. This also applies to the liberal West. With regard to the director of strategic bombings against Germany, it was observed, quote, as a young pilot, Harris was practiced civilian bombings against rebelling Indians. His shock psychology was also originally tested as a cultural shock. Primitive tribes in thatched huts who were confronted with the weapons arsenal of the industrial empire threw themselves down, dazzled. Unquote. On the other hand, it was above all Churchill who promoted this type of war, who, on the one hand, suggested hitting the recalcitrant natives in Iraq with bombardments based on gas bombs and, above all, mustard gas, and on the other hand, compared Germans to evil Huns. We also know of the weight of racial ideology in the US war against Japan, which, not by chance, is subsequently subjected to atomic bombing. Here again emerges a supplement of violence that cannot be justified by supreme emergency, but that refers instead to the colonial ideology shared by the liberal West and Germany. If the Third Reich compares the natives of Eastern Europe to slaughtered Native Americans and enslaved blacks, England and the United States end up treating Germans and Japanese as colonial peoples who must be brought back to obedience. Stalin, Peter the Great, and the New Lincoln. With reference in particular to the role played in the Second Time of Troubles, not a few scholars, taking up a motif that we have already presented, that we have seen already present in Churchill, have compared Stalin to Peter the Great. Even the objection raised in this regard, Peter, unlike Stalin, looked to the West and wanted to open his state to it, does not seem to me persuasive. The combination of Asiatic regulations, the barbarian Asiatic policies, and the Asiatic tactics for which the government and bourgeoisie of Tsarist Russia are responsible is an essential moment for Stalin's revolutionary agitation. At least until October 1917. He is in no doubt that his country is at every level more backward than Western democracies, where bloody anti-Jewish pogroms raging in the semi-Asian country do not take place. After gaining power, Stalin not only insisted on the need to adopt Western technology, but also declared that if they were truly to live up to the Leninist principles, Bolshevik cadres must be able to interweave Russian revolutionary impulse with the spirit of American practicality. In 1932, again, referring to the United States, he expressed appreciation for the traditions in industry and productive practice. They have an element of democratism about them. In reference to Peter the Great, in order to explain the history of Soviet Russia, seems all the more persuasive because of the fact that Lenin, already in May 1918, and above all, Stalin explicitly referred to him, again, May 1918. And at times, Stalin seemed to take the figure of the great Tsar as a model. Trotsky himself, while denouncing the betrayal of the revolution, wrote,
"In relation to the many spheres of people, the Soviet Stalin's power is to a considerable extent carrying out the historical task fulfilled by Peter I and his colleagues in relation to old Muscovy, only on a larger scale and at a swifter tempo.
It is also interesting to note that, at the conclusion of his trip to the Soviet Union in 1927, as great a philosopher as Benjamin referred with sympathetic interest to the thesis of some literati who see in Bolshevism the crowning achievement of Peter the Great. Finally, one could go backward and recall a prediction of Marx's. After hinting at the upheavals of unprecedented violence that would be caused by age-old contradictions of Tsarist Russia, he concluded that the Russian 1793 will be the second turning point in Russian history, and finally place real and great civilization in the place of the false and deceptive civilization introduced by Peter the Great. And, however, while it may serve partially to illuminate the relationship with the history of Russia and with the Second Time of Troubles, the comparison in question leaves in the shadows the Second 30 Years' War and the extraordinary influence exerted by Stalin at the global level. His 1924 condemnation of the scandalous disparity between nations, theorized and imposed by imperialism, and his exhortation to tear down the walls between whites and blacks, peoples considered civilized and peoples excluded from this dignity. The inauguration of a profoundly internationalist constitution, as Stalin stressed in presenting the project, and based on the proposition that all nations and races have equal rights, regardless of skin color, language, and degree of economic and military development. All this could not fail to arouse a profound response, not only in the colonies, but also in the colonized peoples located in the very heart of the West. In the US South, where the white supremacy regime was still raging, a new climate was spreading. The Soviet Union and Stalin were looked upon with hope as the new Lincoln, the Lincoln who would have put an end, this time in concrete and definitive way, to the enslavement of blacks, through the oppression, degradation, humiliation, violence, and lynchings that they continue to suffer. As it advanced towards autocracy, Stalin's USSR powerfully influenced the struggle of African Americans and colonized people against racist despotism. In the US South, a new and worrying phenomenon was being witnessed from the point of view of the ruling caste. It is the growing impudence of young blacks. These, thanks to the communists, were in fact beginning to receive what the powers that be had stubbornly denied them. A culture that goes far beyond the elementary education traditionally given to those destined to provide semi-servile work in the service of the master race. Now, on the other hand, in schools organized by the Communist Party in the North or in Moscow schools in Stalin's USSR, black citizens were busy studying economics, politics, world history. They questioned these disciplines so as to understand the reasons for the harsh fate reserved for them in a country which also claims to be the champion of freedom. A profound change took place in those who attended these schools. The impudence reproached to them by the white supremacy regime was in reality the self-esteem that had hitherto been hindered and trampled upon. A black woman delegate to the International Congress of Women Against War and Fascism, held in Paris in 1934, was extraordinarily impressed by the relationships of equality and fraternity. despite the differences of language and race that were established among the participants in that initiative promoted by the communists. It was heaven on earth, quote unquote. Those who came to Moscow observed a contemporary American historian, experienced a sense of freedom that was unheard of in the South. A black man could fall in love with a white Soviet woman and marry her, even though, on his return home, he could not take her with him, knowing full well that the fate that awaited those guilty of misgention and racial bastardization. The hopes of African Americans placed in the new Lincoln were not as naive as they might seem. Let us reflect on the timing and manner that characterized the end of the white supremacist regime. In December 1952, the U.S. Secretary of Justice sent an eloquent letter to the Supreme Court, which was busy debating the question of integration in public schools. Quote, racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubt even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Washington, the American historian, who reconstructs the affair, observes, was in danger of alienating the colored races, not only in the East and in the Third World, but in the very heart of the United States. Here, too, communist propaganda was considerably successful in its attempt to win blacks to the revolutionary cause, causing their faith in the American institutions to collapse. There is no doubt concern about the challenge objectively represented by the USSR and the influence it exerted on colonized people played an essential role in this affair. It is not just because of the impulse somehow imprinted on the process of emancipation of African Americans that Stalin indirectly influenced the configuration of democracy itself in the West. Stalin, in his speech introducing the draft of the new Constitution, condemned en bloc the three great discriminations that have characterized the history of the liberal West. Quote, it is not the census, nor national origin, nor sex that should determine political and social standing, but only the personal ability and personal labor of every citizen in society. Unquote. At the moment that he had thus expressed himself, the three great discriminations were still present in various forms and to various degrees in this or that country of the liberal West. Finally, in pronouncing himself in favor of overcoming the three great discriminations, Stalin also declared that the new constitution was called upon to guarantee the right to work, the right to rest, the right to education, and to ensure better material and cultural conditions, all within the framework of the realization of socialist democratization. It is the theorization of social and economic rights that, according to Hayek, represented the ruinous legacy of the Marxist Russian Revolution, and profoundly influenced the claim for the welfare state in the West. Let us return to Russia. The reader will have noticed that, when I speak of Stalinism, I use quotation marks. For today's followers of Trotsky, the expression is used in relation to the most diverse political realities. For example, to label the ruling group of post-Maoist China. But even if one wants to refer exclusively to the USSR, the category of Stalinism, quote unquote, is not persuasive. It seems to presuppose a homogeneous set of doctrines and behaviors that does not exist. In the 3 decades in which he was in power, we see Stalin struggling to elaborate and put into practice a government program taking note of the vanishing prospect of the global triumph of the socialist revolution, and the disentangling himself between utopia, which is the legacy on the one hand of Marx's theory, and on the other hand of the messianic expectation of a totally new world aroused by the horror of the First World War, and the state of exception, in which Russia assumed an exceptional duration and acuity because of the convergence of two gigantic crises: the Second Time of Troubles and the Second 30 Years' War. Given his desire not to question the monopoly of power exercised by the Communist Party, Stalin repeatedly sought to move from the state of exception to a condition of relative normality, with the realization of a Soviet democracy, a socialist democratization, and a socialism without dictatorship of the proletariat. But these attempts failed. It is significant how, immediately after Stalin's death, the problem of succession is settled. The liquidation of Beria is a sort of mafia-style settling of accounts, a private violence making no reference whatsoever either to the state's legal framework or to party statute. The comparison between Stalin and Peter the Great appears then in its problematic nature. On closer inspection, the Second Time of Troubles does not even end with the advent of autocracy. The advent of autocracy coincided with the opening of a new and prolonged state of exception, which saw the outbreak first of a new and frightening world conflict, and then of a Cold War that could turn at any moment into a nuclear apocalypse. It could be said that the Second Time of Troubles actually ended with the collapse of the USSR. As in the case of the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks were unable to adapt to the disappearance or fading away of the state of exception, and thus ended up appearing obsolete and superfluous to the majority of the population. After having achieving the overcoming of the crisis of the whole Russian nation, the Bolsheviks were ultimately overwhelmed by the advent of that relative normality, which had also been the result of their action. It is at the international level, however, that the influence of the October Revolution and of the man who ran Soviet Russia for 3 decades proved most solid. One can be ironic about the magniloquence. One can be ironic about the magniloquence of a constitution that was never actualized. But it must be borne in mind that even purely abstract declarations of principle have historical efficacy. One can recoil in horror from a context that witnesses democracy, with the collapse of racist and colonial despotism, and of the 3 great discriminations. And even more so, social democracy advancing in the wake of a challenge coming from a dictatorial and terror-prone regime. But to indulge in such reaction is ultimately to shy away from the complexity of historical process. Those who would prefer to have a simpler picture before them would do well to reflect on an observation by Marx. Quote, "It is the bad side that produces the movement that makes history." Unquote. And that brings us to the end of chapter 6. Which means next week we will be starting chapter 7. The image of Stalin between history and mythology. Which the first part will then get into the various historical sources of today's image of Stalin. If you enjoyed and appreciated this live reading and you made it all the way to the end, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of these videos, don't want to miss what else I'm putting out, please hit the subscribe button. And please think about coming to join me here on Kick. I'm live every single weekday, starting at about noontime Eastern Standard Time. Red salute. Thanks for listening.